Okay, let's get started. A couple of things. One of them is that just a few words about the exam, which is coming out next Wednesday. So I said at the beginning of the class, but let everybody come in. But let me repeat the format. The format for the exam is going to be a set of multiple choice questions and then a set of essay questions. So we'll have 15 multiple choice questions, and that will be worth 30% of the grade. So 15 multiple choice questions, each one will be worth 2 points towards the final grade for the midterm. And the multiple choice questions should be about the same level of difficulty as the questions you've been getting in the quizzes. In other words, not very hard. So essentially, if you've read the book and you've read the if you've read the books and you've come to lectures, then you shouldn't have any trouble answering multiple choice questions. And typically, people do very well on the multiple choice questions. It's not the sort of thing where we want you to go through and remember every single detail of every part of prenatal development. They should be questions that will be fairly general and will cover things that are fairly general in the class. Okay, so that's the first part. And then the second part will be, which will be worth 70% of the grade, is an essay question. And the way that will work is that there will be 5 essay questions that you'll get in advance. Later on this afternoon, they'll be posted on vSpace, and I'll send out a notice about it. There'll be 5 of these questions. 3 of them will be on the exam, and you'll have to answer 1, which means that you'll have a chance this whole week to prepare 3 of those questions. Everybody got the math? Okay. So you'll have plenty of time to prepare the questions, but the exam itself will be closed book rather than open. So the questions, yeah? No, there'll be only 3 on the test. So what we're going to do is we'll pick 3 of those 5. You'll get 5 this afternoon. 3 of those 5 will be on the exam. You'll have to answer 1. Okay, so that means that if you're preparing, what you should do is think about preparing 3 out of those, at least 3 out of those 5. You might want to prepare more than that, but that would ensure that you'd have at least one that you were well prepared for the exam itself. And some things about the essay questions. They're probably going to be, well, they're not probably. They will be more general and abstract than you might very well be used to from other classes. So instead of being the sort of questions where we'd ask you specifically to sort of say something that's already there in the books or in the lectures, instead these will be questions that will take what it is you already know and try to extend it and apply it. So for example, they're likely to be a question that's something like, take this phenomenon and then describe some phenomenon and explain it in terms of 4 of the different theories that we described in the book. So this will be some new phenomenon we haven't talked about yet, but your job will be to try and say, okay, if I actually saw a child doing this, how would I explain it according to the different theories in the book? Or another likely kind of essay question will be, here's a problem, here's a question, nobody knows the answer to this question, design a study or design 2 or 3 different studies with different methods that would be good studies to answer this question. Or a question might be, here's a child at a particular age with mom in a room that has 3 things in it, just describe what you think is likely to happen in the next half hour. What sort of things is the child likely to do and what sort of things is the mom likely to do? So they're that kind of question. So you can see these are not the sort of questions that you can answer just by checking things that are off in the book. You're going to have to take what we've done in the book and what we've done in lectures and actually try to apply it and think about it in a new context about a new problem. Which I recognize is probably harder than what you may be used to, especially if, say, you're coming from more sciencey classes. But the reason for doing it is that, as I've said several times, sadly, probably every fact that you learn in this class is going to turn out to be wrong 30 years from now. That's the way that science works. But what won't turn out to be wrong is the technique, the method, the way of thinking scientifically that lets you say, if you have this kind of problem, here's the way to actually solve the problem. Or if you have this kind of evidence, here's the way you can explain it in terms of different kinds of theories. And actually, as a real scientist, I can't go, when I have a problem to ask, I can't actually say, okay, well, let me just check what it says about that in the textbook. That there would be no reason for them to pay me the not very big bucks to do that. What I actually have to do as a scientist is to take a question that's never been asked before, where we don't know anything, and try to figure out how to answer it. Try to figure out what kind of answer would be a good answer. That's the real skill that you need to have as a scientist. So what I want to do with these essay questions is to give you a chance to actually practice some of that skill. So as I say, that means these questions are a little different from questions that you might be used to. So in terms of actually answering those questions effectively, one thing is that we'll post some examples of essay questions that were well done in the past. We should have some examples of that. But here's some tips about how to do that. One tip is how well you write and how clearly you write makes a big difference for this kind of an essay. So it really is an essay. You should think about it as really like writing an essay rather than just doing an exam. So it's very important to try to think as clearly as you can about what you're going to say and write it as clearly as you possibly can. The temptation that I think people often have with these questions is to do a sort of brain data dump where you just write down everything that you can think of that you read in the book or heard in lectures that has anything possible to do with the topic of the essay. And you can end up with a really long essay that doesn't get a very good grade, even though every fact in it might be true, and every fact in it might in fact be something that we talked about in the book or in the lectures. The point is not just write down as many facts as you can think of in the space of half an hour, but organize them, have them make sense, make sure that they're logically related to one another, and so forth. And that's why you have a whole week to actually prepare to do that. So during this week, you can find any of the facts that you want. The important thing is how you put those facts together and whether or not those facts make sense. So often a shorter essay will actually get a better grade than a longer essay for this kind of an exam, because the idea is how clearly are you thinking about this topic, not just how many facts can you write down. So think about how to write it very clearly. Different faculty members have different ideas about scientific writing. As you can probably tell from reading The Scientist in the Crib, I think the best scientific writing is like the best writing in general. I would much rather have it be clear and colloquial and be in language that's comfortable for you and easy for me to understand than to try to pretend that you're writing it with all the jargon that we use as scientists. So try to be as clear and as simple and as straightforward as you possibly can. Okay. That said, you can't just make it up off the top of your head. So the essay should show that you have read the book, that you have gone to lectures, that you have thought about the ideas that are in the that we've been discussing in the class. So you should be certainly making reference to things that we talked about in class or things that we talked about in the book, but just writing things down from lecture notes or from the book isn't going to work for answering these essay questions. Let me see. Another thing is very often people will prepare for these in groups, and that's a terrific idea. There's lots and lots of evidence that getting together a group of people to work on something is much more effective than just having an individual person do it. So I encourage you to get together in study groups and help to prepare. But on the other hand, we'll be kind of looking out to make sure that we don't get 20 versions of exactly the same essay. So sometimes it's tempting to say, okay, we'll take the essays and you write this one and hand it out to all the 5 people in the study group, and you write the other one and hand it out to all the 5 people in the study group. But the GSIs are all going, each of the GSIs is going to be reading one of the essays, so they'll notice if they start seeing exactly the same thing as showing up in everybody's essay. So very good idea to have study groups. Very good idea to work on this beforehand in concert, but make sure that what you're writing is actually original. Okay, any other questions? Yeah?
So are you saying that if a group of people come together to determine what they think is the best answer to a question as a group, that's just because they all agree that that's the best answer, we penalize for it?
Well, if what we see is just the same answer over and over again, then you'll be penalized for that. And you just have to sort of figure out how much what you're doing is just writing down the essay that someone else actually wrote for you, and how much what you're doing is getting together with a bunch of people and saying, here's what the right answer to this essay is. And again, the good thing is because these essays are pretty wide-ranging, it isn't going to be like there'll be just one right way of answering the question. In fact, there should be many different good ways of answering the question. Yeah. Well, you'll have an hour in class to write it, and then you'll have to take a little bit of time. It shouldn't take very long to do those multiple choice questions. As I say, it's not. You probably will need the whole hour to write the essay properly, so you're probably not going to get done quickly. But often shorter essays are better than longer essays. There's a quote, I think, from George Orwell, who was writing to his editor, which I often use myself, who said, I'm sorry, this letter would have been much shorter if I had more time, which is often true. So it's actually harder to write shorter than it is to write longer. It takes more time to write something that's short than something that's long, but it makes it much easier for the person who's reading it. So try to be concise and clear. That's more important than the actual length. Yeah? Yes, you need to bring blue books. And what we'll do is we'll have some kind of a technique so that we'll do something like start on the fourth line or turn the blue books upside down or something like that to make sure that people can't bring blue books that are already filled out. So just to tune into that, because sometimes what happens is everybody's so fussed because they're getting started on the exam that they don't notice that it says on the board that you should start 3 lines down. So keep your eye out for the cheating busting trick about how you should fill out your blue books. And you should also bring a green scantron for the multiple choice, but we'll repeat that next time. And as I said last time, there will be a review session next Monday at 7, and what you should do is come to that review session with the questions you have about the material. Again, we won't give you the answers to the essays, but you should be thinking about the kinds of questions that have come up, things that aren't clear, things that you need to think about as a result of writing the essays. And the GSIs will be there to answer those questions. That session is not going to be in this room, it'll be in a room in Evans, but you've gotten an email that gives you all the details about that. And then on top of that, in session this week, we'll be having a Jeopardy activity, which is actually kind of like a quiz on the quiz like Jeopardy, in which we'll make up different teams and try and see who can answer more of the questions about the reading best. So that should give you another chance to actually get a review of the course material. Are there any other questions about that? And I will have office hours next week at 3, so we can, if you need to talk to me then, you can talk to me about it then too. Okay, is that clear to everybody? Any other questions about any of that? I know the exams are sources of tension, so. Okay, so let's get back to thinking about language development, and we're going to have a less pretty PowerPoint presentation than usual, because this is just boring old theories, which is much less fun than actually seeing pictures of the children doing things. But in the case of language development, trying to work out what the different theories are and how they would explain things is actually pretty important. And remember, I said at the end of last session that the children's learning language is one of those hummingbird problems. It's something that looks completely impossible, except that we know that they actually do it. And it looks completely impossible, and I think it's fair to say that none of the theoretical explanations that anyone's ever given, or even all of the theoretical explanations combined, still can't really explain how it's possible for children to do this as effectively as they do in as short a time as they do. So it's still one of those really basic, deep mysteries of developmental psychology. How could children possibly learn as much language as they do as quickly as they do? So here are some of the different theories that people have proposed. One set of theories are these nativist theories. These are like the innate module theories that we talked about when we talked about cognitive development. And the most famous person who originally talked about this was Noam Chomsky. You may have read some of Steven Pinker's books, like A Language Instinct. Steven Pinker was a student of Chomsky's and has popularized Chomsky ideas. And until Chomsky came along, until the early 60s, if you asked most psychologists how children learn language, they would have said, well, maybe they imitate the words that they hear other people around them saying, or maybe they're reinforced for saying the right things and they're rewarded for saying the right things and punished for saying the wrong things. Neither of those explanations were very good, and in fact, people didn't pay very much attention to the problem until about the 60s. And what Chomsky noticed was that when you actually looked at what you could do when you had a language, it was an incredibly powerful system. And we talked about that a little bit last time, too. You think about what you have to do just to be able to understand any sentence or produce any sentence. It's an amazingly complicated process. And Chomsky also pointed out something I mentioned last time, which is almost every sentence that you hear and almost every sentence that you speak is actually brand new. It's actually going to be a sentence that you certainly haven't ever spoken or heard before, and quite possibly a sentence that no one in the history of the human race has ever spoken or heard before. So somehow you have to be able to deal with these brand new languages. And Chomsky articulated something that he called the poverty of the stimulus problem. And the poverty of the stimulus problem is, how could you ever figure out this very, very complicated and abstract system of rules just from the sounds that you hear around you? And in fact, if you look at a transcript, say, of just people talking, every once in a while there'll be some, I guess the most recent one was like the Rob Blagojevich trial, where you actually read a transcript of a bunch of people talking on the phone. Now, in the Blagojevich case, there were also a tremendous number of obscenities, but aside from the obscenities, when you actually look at a transcript of people actually talking, it looks like they're just complete idiots. Now, in Blagojevich's case, he probably was a complete idiot, but even if you take a smart person and just do a transcript of exactly what they say, they sound like a complete idiot, because they're hesitating, they're stopping, they're starting, there's there's likes, sometimes they completely lose the thread of what they're saying. So if you actually think about the words that our babies and children are hearing, at least at first glance, it seems as if there's this terrible problem. How could you ever figure out this complicated abstract system from this mess that's the language that you're actually hearing every day? So that's what Chomsky called the poverty of the stimulus problem. And it's a real problem and continues to be a problem to this day. And what Chomsky proposed as a solution to this problem was that we had an innate, what's called language acquisition device. Our genes made our brains, our genes had constituted our brains so that we were designed to take that messy stuff that was coming in our ears and infer exactly the kind of system of complicated rules that we need for a language. So he thought that this language acquisition device could help. And in particular, he thought that the way that it could help is that it could give you information about what all the possible languages of the world are like, and I'll get to that in a minute. And one of the other points that Chomsky wanted to make especially is that language is not only complicated and rule-governed, but it's often very arbitrary. Remember when we were thinking about those over-regularizations? That was a good example, where we'll have a rule, and sometimes it'll apply sometimes, and other times it won't apply other times. Some languages put the subject before the verb before the object. Other languages put the verb first and then put the subject and then put the object. As we were saying last time, in English we use a certain amount of morphology, endings at the end of words. In Chinese, they don't use that technique at all. In Russian, they use it all the time, and they don't use other things like word order. So it seems as if there's just this kind of arbitrariness about how language works. It doesn't seem like there's any obvious sort of principles about how a particular language ought to work. And that's particularly true about syntax. Okay, what's some of the evidence for this nativist view? Well, one kind of evidence that people have talked about is the fact that children learn language very young, and essentially all children, with very few exceptions, seem to learn language. So it doesn't seem to be the sort of thing that you need to be particularly smart or talented or rich to actually do. It just seems to be something that unfolds naturally for all of us. A second point, the one that I mentioned before, is that there seems to be this kind of infinite generativity, so that we can produce and hear brand new sentences that we've never heard before. So it couldn't be that we're just learning the particular sentences, for example, that our parents produce. Another kind of evidence is the fact that when you look across different languages, in spite of the fact that they're superficially quite different, it turns out that there are some broad principles that they seem to have in common. So, for example, in all the languages that we know of, we have structure, syntactic structure to words. So, for example, there's no language that actually turns a positive statement into a negative statement by just saying, all right, now just recite that backwards. Okay. Remember we were talking about how complicated the rules were that turn a positive into a negative in English? Well, those rules are complicated in all languages, but no language has a rule that says just take the last word of the sentence and recite do all the words in reverse order. So they always are using structured ideas like verbs and nouns to constitute the grammatical rules. They never just are arbitrary rules. There's no real language that works like Pig Latin where you just put one ending on the end of a word and so forth. So when we look across languages, we see that there seem to be some of these universal principles that all languages share, even though superficially they might be quite different. And Chomsky thought that universal structure, that kind of what he called that universal grammar, was actually what was there genetically. So the picture is you've got this kind of template, kind of program in your head for a language, and it includes all the features that all languages share, and then what you have to do is just fill in the details about how your particular language works. Another phenomenon that seems to be supportive of the nativist idea is a really fascinating language phenomenon, which is the development of pidgins and creoles. So what are pidgins and creoles? Well, pidgins are languages that come about when people who don't speak the same language have to communicate with one another. And some of the kind of classic pidgins came in places like Haiti or in the South Sea Islands, where you had many people speaking many different languages, say English and French, as well as the native languages that people there were originally speaking, and they had to figure out some way of talking to one another. And then what happens is that people invent these very simplified languages, they're called pidgins, to try to communicate with one another. So the interesting phenomenon, so these are kind of invented, made up, very much simpler languages that people can use to talk to one another. Now, the interesting thing that happens sometimes is that you'll get two people who don't actually speak each other's language, but who get married and have children. So those children are growing up in a household where the only language that anybody ever speaks is the pidgin language. That's the language that people use to communicate. Now, what happens when a child's learning one of these very, very simple pidgins as their first language? Well, it turns out that the child actually turns that simple language into a much more complicated language, which is called a creole. So when you actually look at the language of the children who are the first generation, the next generation of speakers, the speakers who are learning pidgin for the first time, they make that language into something that's much more complicated, and it looks much more like a natural language than the language that they actually heard. So that's a nice example where they're hearing something that's very, very simple, and yet they're producing something that's much more complicated. A nice recent example of this that one of my students has actually studied, which is really sign language is a really good example of this because, for example, in Nicaragua, until about 30 years ago, there weren't any central schools for deaf people. So what happened was that deaf children were just making up their own little sign languages in their own families all by themselves. And then what happened was that about, 25 years ago now, they started a central school for the deaf in Managua in which they taught Nicaraguan sign language. So they taught all the children sign language, and the children heard the sign language the same language from the time they were very young. And what they discovered was that the children started making a language for themselves that was a kind of combination of the official language and all the languages that they had used independently that was much more complicated than the language that they had been hearing at home. So we can see the way that the children are taking pidgins and turning them into creoles. And that suggests that it isn't just what you hear that's shaping your language. The children are doing something else to shape the language. Is that clear to everybody? And a last example of evidence for the nativist view is that there are some children who have an incredibly hard time learning language. They suffer from something called specific language impairment. And in fact, my mother was one of the first people to discover that there was a family that actually seemed to have a gene that led to this very specific kind of language impairment. So these were children who could hear perfectly well, and they had perfectly good intelligence, they had normal IQ, they had normal social development, and yet they seemed to have very, very specific difficulties with the syntax of language. They couldn't do things like understand those word endings that change something into a plural or change something into a past tense. Yeah? Well, that's an interesting question. One of the things that Myrna discovered was that if you looked at the same gene, say for children learning English versus learning Greek, they made different mistakes. So children who had this particular genetic disorder had trouble learning different languages, but it was interesting because depending on what the language was like, they made different kinds of errors. So for example, the specific thing that this language impairment seemed to involve, as I said, was those word endings, those inflections on the end of words. So the children would have a really hard time figuring out, for instance, that you'd say, I walked to the store, or there were two wugs here. So they had a really hard time with those inflections. Now the interesting thing is that when children with those genes were learning a language like Chinese, they didn't have a big problem because Chinese doesn't use inflections very much. When they were trying to learn a language like Russian or Greek was the example that my mother looked at, that uses a lot of inflections, they had a miserable time. So it seemed as if this genetic problem was just affecting one particular kind of capacity, the capacity to do the inflections, and it kind of depended on what your language was like about whether that was a really big problem or not such a big problem. Yeah? Right, they were still learning everything else normally. It wasn't that their intelligence was, and their cognitive development seemed to be okay. It seemed to be something quite specific. And it's important to say, as in all these cases, it wasn't that if you had this variant of the gene, you necessarily ended up with language impairment. There are lots of people who had this variant and whose language was perfectly fine. But if you had this particular kind of language impairment, it was more likely that you also had this kind of gene. So as with all gene-environment interactions, it was something was happening that was an interaction between the gene and the environment that was leading to the disorder. It wasn't like the gene was just straightforwardly leading to it. Okay? So that also is evidence that there's something that's going on in our genetics that's acting as the basis for our language learning. So that's one approach to language. There are a number of other approaches to language that say it isn't really that there's